Welcome to this screencast about pollen and spore examination. As you see, there are several objectives that you'll be able to do after this unit. So this discipline is called forensic palynology, and this is a very specialized field. There are many different species of both angiosperms, which are flower-producing plants, and gymnosperms, which are that means naked seed. Otherwise, they produce pine cones that hold their seeds. And for each one of those, there may be a slightly different form of pollen grain that can be identified by species. And you might wonder, well, this is not a botany class. Why are we talking about that? But again, forensics includes lots of different subdisciplines. And so this specialized field of pollen and spore evidence can be helpful in several ways as it has to do with forensic investigation. We'll look at that in just a moment. This image was taken with a scanning electron microscope, and pollen is beautiful. It may be something that annoys you because you have an allergy to it, but nevertheless you can't deny the beauty that you see under a scanning electron microscope. This image is of spores, and that's taken with a compound light microscope. Now, pollen is basically plant sperm, and so that could be from a flower, or it could be from a cone-producing plant. Spores are the equivalent, not so much of male gametes or male sperm, but they're sort of the equivalent of seeds for certain protists, algae, certain plants, and fungi. It all goes back to Locard's principle of exchange. The idea that when a person goes somewhere, they deposit something, they take something with them. And that something can be pollen. And since pollen is specific to species, it's also specific to location in that sense. So some of the things that can be determined are whether a body was moved. Let's say that the body has pollen grains on the clothing or on the skin that are not indigenous to the area where the body was found. That can be a sign of the body being moved. Again, with the location, whether city or country, and the seasonality as well, as certain pollen grains are evident at only certain times of the year. So that it's actually called a pollen fingerprint, the number and type of pollen grains found in a geographic area. Now, there are some non-seed plants, which include ferns, mosses, liverworts, and horsetails, and these would be spore-producing plants, whereas seed plants, such as gymnosperms, including conifers, pine trees, Christmas trees, as well as the cycads and ginkgos, these are going to produce the kind of pollen that gets everywhere in the spring, all over your car. It's kind of like, here's the plant sperm, get out there, go as far as you can. Whereas whereas the angiosperm type of seed plants is a little more controlled, a little more contained in terms of the pollen or male sperm, and that would be in a flowering plant. So all of these are relevant to what we're looking at today. Now, gymnosperms, as we said, include the conifers and ginkgos, and they produce these hard, scaly structures that we call cones. And basically, the male cones pollinate the female cones. So there are no flowers, no fruits on these trees. And can you think about which one of these is a male versus female cone? If you said that the male cone is the one on the left, female is the one on the right, then you would be correct, because the female pine cone is designed to be more open, and that allows for pollen grains to come in toward that inner core of the cone, which is where the egg would be stored for fertilization. This cone over here, these cones, would be male cones, which their job is to emit pollen. Okay. Now, transitioning over to angiosperms, this is a more recent group evolutionarily, and so the idea is that they're a flowering plant, and that the ovary of that flower that holds any eggs would be fertilized by pollen, and then that ovary becomes either a fruit or a nut. And we'll look at, so there are female parts and male parts to a flower. If you thought that a flower's purpose was to be pretty and maybe to be given to you on Valentine's Day, then you would be wrong. It is entirely a sexual organ and is used for reproduction. as many things are in biology. So let's take a look at some of the parts of the flower. And I want you to think about this when you look at a flower again. Don't look at the flower the same way that you have before. So the female part is this part in the center. It's called a stigma. And the style is the tube that goes all the way down to the female ovary, which includes ovules. And this is where the eggs are, not fertilized yet. Now these parts are the male parts. So this part on the end is called the anther, and the piece that the anther is connected to is called the filament. And this is where the angiosperm pollen resides. And so the idea is that the pollen would go from the male part and down and fertilize the egg. Now, most plants have mechanisms against self-pollination, so they don't really want their own pollen fertilizing their own eggs. And that's to increase genetic recombination or diversity. But some plants do allow that to happen at certain periods of time. So again, types of pollination. In general, it's the transfer of pollen from the male part to the female part of the plant. Self-pollination is a little bit more rare, but can happen. Cross-pollination is between two distinct plants of the same species. So this is generally how it happens. A lot of times flowers are aided by insects such as bees. Sometimes it's bats. But bees are really huge in pollinating the 30 plants or so that make up maybe 90% of our food sources, whether fruits or vegetables. So the idea is that a bee is interested in the nectar of the flower, bumps up against the anthers which hold the pollen, lands on another plant's flower, and in going for the nectar, that pollen that has gotten on its back from the previous flower gets onto the female parts and goes down the style and fertilizes the eggs. So pollen can be carried by wind, which is generally more the mechanism of gymnosperms, and animals as well as water. And it can go pretty long distances. Now, let's transition from pollen to spores. Both are microscopic generally, or at least we can see them better through use of the microscope. But spores, you can think of them as being very resilient seeds. So some of these organisms will produce spores. They're also a type of bacterial spore called anthrax, which you may have heard of, and this is toxic to people. And so the idea is that the anthrax spores can be inhaled, and then that bacteria can begin to grow in the lungs, which can be a very dangerous thing. So the way that spores are dispersed, it can be into water or air, and mushroom spores are a good example. The spores live in the fruiting body of the mushroom, and I actually made this spore print, and it's nature meets art here. So I found a really big fruiting body or mushroom, cut off the stem, placed it on this piece of paper, and let gravity do the work of bringing the spores down onto the paper, and then I sprayed it with a clear spray paint, and you get this beautiful image of the spores that were once within that fruiting body. So again, these spores would have the complete genetic code for a new mushroom or a new bacteria or whatever that spore is for. Okay. And just like with pollen, spores can be used to determine location, whether a body's been moved or where the crime may have occurred, based on the type of spore that it is. So a little bit more about pollen here. You may see two images of pollen that look kind of distinctly different like this. Generally, the pollen that looks kind of like the anther itself on the flower is an angiosperm or fruiting origin of this pollen. And this spiky looking pollen is usually from a gymnosperm. So here are some sources of pollen and spore evidence, and I'll let you take a look at this. Please pause your video now. In collecting pollen and spores, you must have the evidence, whether that would be the thing on the body or immediately surrounding the body, as well as control samples. So you want to take samples from the nearby area for comparison. And general protocol applies here: wearing gloves, clean tools, sterile containers, appropriate labels, and chain of custody. This is just a small-scale example of the incredible, tedious, and detail-oriented nature of palynologists. So this would be a reference sample where these different species of pollen grains have been documented, and so you can use those reference collections to try to identify something from a crime scene. And we've also been looking at images throughout this screencast of compound light microscopes, scanning electron microscopes, which give really excellent detail. And so it needs to be collected, analyzed, interpreted, and then can be presented in court. All right, well, thank you for tuning in to this screencast. Hope you learned something. Take a look at the summaries.